Hello, and welcome to the Book Tapestry. When we read historical fiction, we usually think the tension lies in a simple question: what is real, and what only feels real? When I first read Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, I thought I was settling in for a classic, atmospheric murder mystery set in a gloomy, medieval monastery. But I realized very quickly that I couldn't just follow the trail of bodies. There was something shifting beneath the floorboards, something deeply systemic, theological, and intensely political. I found myself staring at a historical question that, frankly, sounds absurd to modern ears. Did Jesus Christ own his own clothes? Did Christ and his apostles actually own property? Welcome back to the show. I'm Sophia Wordsmith, and this is episode 20. Today, we are looking into apostolic poverty and why this created such a tension in medieval Europe. To a 21st century observer, this looks like a minor, pedantic, theological glitch, the kind of argument medieval monks spun out just to fill the silent hours. But as I dove into the research, my assumptions were completely shattered. This wasn't a footnote, it was a spark. In the 14th century, asking whether Christ owned a purse wasn't a philosophical exercise. It was the equivalent of questioning the entire economic architecture of the global superpower of the day. It was a direct threat to the system's core operating source code. To understand why this question caused so much trouble, we have to look at the medieval world not as a collection of chaotic kingdoms, but as a massive corporate and administrative network. At the macro level, you have the Papacy. Pope John XXII is ruling not from Rome but from Avignon, managing an immense, wealthy, bureaucratic apparatus. The Church isn't just a spiritual guide here, it's a massive political body controlling vast swaths of land, immense wealth, and unmatched geopolitical influence. Now, let's zoom into the micro level. The Franciscan Order, founded by Francis of Assisi. Francis came from extreme wealth, but he chose a path of radical, absolute poverty. The core engine of his movement was built on three strict directives: no ownership, no accumulation, and a total, literal imitation of Christ. Think of this like an open-source, anti-materialist operating system trying to run inside a highly centralized, heavily monetized corporate network. For a while, the macro system tries to patch the glitch. In the 13th century, Pope Nicholas III issues a legal compromise. He rules that the Franciscan can use physical goods, like food, books, and robes, but the actual legal ownership of those goods belongs to the Papacy. It's a brilliant, if highly unstable, piece of legal fiction. The Franciscan get to remain poor, and the Church retains control over the property. But as I was mapping out this timeline, I realized that this compromise only delayed the conflict. It never resolved the core contradiction. By the late 1200s and early 1300s, the system fractures. A stricter fundamentalist group emerges within the movement, the spiritual Franciscans. They refuse the legal patch. They look directly at the biblical source code, citing passages like Matthew 8:20, "The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head," and Luke 9:3, where disciples are told to take nothing for the journey. To the spirituals, these texts aren't metaphors. They mean absolute non-possession, both individually and collectively. And this is the exact moment where theology turns into an existential weapon. The spirituals run a simple, devastating logical equation. If Christ owned absolutely nothing, then the Church must own nothing to truly represent him. If the Church is wealthy, it has betrayed Christ. And if it has betrayed Christ, it loses its systemic legitimacy. Suddenly, the debate shifts from a quiet practice of humility to a loud accusation of systemic corruption. When Pope John XXII takes power, he recognizes the immense danger. If you allow people to argue that institutional wealth is inherently unchristian, the entire economic and political stability of Europe begins to unravel. So, he strikes back. In 1322, he executes a total papal reversal, declaring that absolute poverty is not a required doctrine. Then, in 1323, he issues the papal bull Cum inter non nullos, officially declaring the belief that Christ owned nothing to be heretical. Think about the sheer weight of that moment. With a stroke of a pen, a central pillar of Franciscan identity is transformed into a capital crime. Disagreement is no longer a debate, it's treason against the spiritual state. This brings us directly to 1327, the exact year Umberto Eco drops us into his fictional monastery. The doctrinal explosion has already happened. Intellectual titans of the Franciscan Order, like Michael of Cesena and William of Ockham, are actively defying the Pope, even aligning themselves with the Holy Roman Emperor, Louis IV, for political protection. Inside the walls of Eco's abbey, we see a microcosm of this massive ideological war. The monastery isn't just a background setting, it's a particle accelerator where competing philosophies are forced into a violent collision. We see this beautifully dramatized in the ideological clash between our investigator, William of Baskerville, and the blind librarian, Jorge of Burgos. William represents the force of inquiry. His philosophy is empirical, rational, and completely open to uncertainty. For him, truth emerges through constant inquiry and multi-layered interpretation. He is a modern scientific processing unit, completely comfortable with a plurality of meanings. Jorge, on the other hand, represents the force of preservation. His philosophy is dogmatic, defensive, and unyielding. To Jorge, truth is already fixed, finished, and must be guarded at all costs using secrecy, fear, and ultimate suppression. He is an uncompromising firewall. The real battle here isn't just about who committed the murders. It's about how humanity handles truth. And what is Jorge protecting inside the labyrinth? A lost book by Aristotle dedicated to comedy and laughter. To Jorge, laughter is the ultimate systemic virus. Why? Because laughter destroys fear. If ordinary people can laugh at authority, they stop fearing the rigid doctrines of the papal court. And when fear evaporates, the entire infrastructure of enforced power collapses along with it. When you look past the Gothic imagery of the abbey, you realize that the conflict over apostolic poverty and the conflict over the hidden library are actually the exact same war. They are both fights over monopoly and control. The Church wanted a monopoly on material wealth and the right to define how society operates. The library wanted a monopoly on intellectual wealth, keeping dangerous ideas hidden away in a confusing labyrinth where only an elite few could access them. In both cases, the institutional authority tells the same lie. We are protecting you from things you aren't strong enough to handle. The tragedy, both in history and in the novel, is how this tension resolves. John XXII ultimately unleashes the Inquisition, led by figures like Bernard Guy, to systematically crush the spiritual Franciscans through imprisonment and execution. Ideas are replaced by sheer force. And it leaves us with a deeply unsettling, profound question that still echoes in our modern world. Can any grand, idealistic system, whether it's a spiritual movement, a political ideology, or a modern digital network, remain faithful to its original liberating purpose once it acquires massive wealth, institutional power, and the desire to control the narrative? Or is it an inevitability that institutions will always burn their own founding ideals to preserve their survival? What if the ultimate battleground for reality isn't fought on an open field, but within the silent, restricted networks of a medieval library? In this episode of the Book Tapestry, we stepped into the labyrinthine stone walls of Umberto Eco's masterpiece, The Name of the Rose. But this wasn't a conventional chat about a historical murder mystery. Instead, we dissected the medieval abbey through a cross-disciplinary lens, treating its religious structures as competing socio-political ecosystems running their own highly specialized, self-contained operating systems. But as we close the book on this particular systemic glitch, our diagnostic scan isn't complete. Next time, we are moving from the macro-politics of empire and papacy directly into the micro-environment of the daily routine. We are looking into life inside a medieval abbey, not as a peaceful sanctuary, but as a rigid, highly programmed infrastructure designed to control time, labor, and human behavior. We'll analyze the strict source code of monastic rules, and see what happens to the human psyche when every second of the day is managed by a centralized institutional clock. Until then, you can download our visual conceptual maps, structural operating diagrams, and complete reading lists over at thebooktapestry.com. I'm Sophia Wordsmith. Keep pulling at the threads, analyze the system, and watch the tapestry unfurl. Thank you for listening to the Book Tapestry. If you found this helpful, please share it with a friend who prefers listening over reading. See you next time.